circle of adventure, Jimmy Buffett's captain, sailor, pirate, and kid. There is a way of listening to Jimmy Buffett's music that makes it sound like an escape. The boats, the islands, the bars, the highways, the sunsets, the endless search for the next adventure. But listen closely and something else begins to emerge. Jimmy Buffett wasn't only singing about escaping the ordinary. He was singing about the passage of a life, about how we inherit stories before we have stories of our own, how we go out into the world and collect experiences, how we eventually slow down and look back at the person we became, and perhaps most importantly, how we pass those stories on to someone who is just beginning their own journey. 3 songs capture that progression particularly well. The Captain and the Kid, Son of a Sailor, and A Pirate Looks at 40. I think there's an even deeper connection between them, because Captain and the Kid doesn't simply belong at the end of the story. It starts the story and it ends it. It is the frame around the entire cycle. The kid begins by listening to the captain's stories. Then the kid grows up. The kid becomes the sailor becomes the pirate becomes the captain, and eventually that captain finds himself sitting across from another kid, telling stories about the adventures he once had, and the cycle begins again. Think about what it means to be a kid. When you're young, you don't have a history yet. Your world is made up of other people's stories. You listen to your parents. You listen to your grandparents. You listen to older people talk about places they've been, people they've known, mistakes they've made, and adventures that seem almost impossible from the safety of your childhood. And those stories do something to you. They make the world feel bigger. The kid hears about the captain's life and begins to imagine what might exist beyond the familiar. The stories aren't just entertainment, they're an invitation. Someday you might have stories of your own. And that's where Son of a Sailor enters the cycle. The kid grows up and begins to understand that adventuring isn't just something that he's heard about. It's something that he has inherited. He is the son of a sailor. The sea, the wandering, the independence, the pull towards the horizon, it is part of his identity. And that is such an important stage of life, because when we're young, adventure is about discovery. We want to know what's out there. We want to leave the familiar. We want to test ourselves. We want to find out who we are by experiencing things our parents never did. The sailor represents that period perfectly. He is moving. He is exploring. He is accumulating experiences. And he doesn't necessarily know where all of this is going. And that's okay, because at that point in life, the journey itself is the destination. You don't need a final answer. You need a horizon. Then comes the pirate. And the pirate is where adventure becomes more complicated. Because eventually, you have enough experiences to realize that every adventure has a price. You've made mistakes. You've lost people. You've taken the roads you wouldn't take again. And you've discovered that freedom and responsibility don't always get along. And eventually, you reach the perspective captured in A Pirate Looks at 40. The pirate looks backward. And that's a great change. The young sailor asks, "What's out there?" The pirate begins asking, "What have I done?" And that's the transition from exploration to reflection. When you're young, you measure your life by what you're going to experience. As you get older, you start measuring it by what you have experienced. The places you've been become memories. The people you've met become stories. The mistakes, they become lessons. The reckless nights become anecdotes. And the adventures that once felt like isolated events begin to form a narrative. Your life starts to look like a story. And suddenly, adventure isn't only about finding something new. It's about understanding what the things you've already found mean. That's what makes A Pirate Looks at 40 so powerful. The pirate is still a pirate. He hasn't lost that part of himself, but he's beginning to understand that time is moving. The horizon isn't infinite anymore. And eventually, every sailor has to decide whether he is going to keep sailing or find somewhere to drop anchor. And that's where the captain comes in. The captain isn't simply the sailor who got older. The captain is the person who has gained perspective. He has been out there. He has made mistakes. He has taken chances. He's seen things. He's collected stories. And now he has something that the kid doesn't have, a history. That's why the captain and the kid is so important to the whole cycle. Because when we first encounter the captain, we experience him from the perspective of the kid. The kid doesn't know what the captain knows. He simply hears the stories. The captain becomes larger than life, and the kid begins to imagine what it would be like to live a life worthy of stories like those. But here's the beautiful part. Eventually, the kid becomes the captain. And when that happens, the captain and the kid changes meaning. The story that once belonged to someone else now belongs to him. The kid who once listened is now the one telling the story. And that's the real cycle. The captain creates the kid by telling stories. The kid becomes the sailor by going out and experiencing them. The sailor becomes the pirate by living through them. The pirate becomes the captain by understanding them. And the captain creates another kid by telling them. It's almost a generational cycle. And this is where I think Buffett's idea of settling down becomes much more interesting. Because slowing down isn't failure. Coming home isn't surrender. And becoming domestic isn't necessarily the opposite of adventure. In fact, it may be the natural conclusion of it. When you're young, you want to see the world. Later, you want to understand the world. Eventually, you want to share what you've learned about it. And that requires somewhere to come home to. It requires family. It requires friends. It requires traditions. It requires a place where stories can be told. The adventures, they don't disappear. The role you play in the adventure changes. The sailor is out there making the memories. The pirate is beginning to reflect on them. The captain is preserving them, and the kid is listening. That's why a slower, more domestic life can actually be the culmination of adventures in life rather than its opposite. The captain doesn't need to be on the water every day. He's already been there. He doesn't need to chase every horizon. He's learned which horizons mattered, and now, perhaps, the greatest adventure is watching someone else leave the dock for the first time. That's the part of the story that I find most moving. Eventually, every kid becomes the person they once listened to. The kid sitting on the floor, listening to stories about boats and distant places, grows up. He becomes the teenager who wants to leave, the young adult who actually leaves. Then the person who spends decades accumulating experiences. And one day, without realizing exactly when it happened, he becomes the older person sitting across from a kid who is fascinated by his stories. And that kid is looking at him the same way he once looked at the captain. The circle is closed, but it isn't really an ending. It's a beginning. Because the purpose of the captain's stories isn't to convince the kid to live the captain's life. It's to give the kid permission to go find his own. That's the difference between inheritance and imitation. The captain passes down the spirit of adventure, not necessarily the exact adventure. The next generation gets its own ocean, its own road, its own mistakes, its own stories, and someday its own kid. So if we put these three songs together, I think they tell one much larger story. The captain and the kid gives us the beginning and the end. The kid listens, the captain remembers, and between those two perspectives is an entire lifetime. Son of a sailor gives us the beginning of that lifetime, the desire to inherit adventure and go find the horizon. A pirate looks at 40 gives us the middle, the moment when adventure becomes memory and exploration becomes reflection. And then the captain and the kid brings us back around. The sailor becomes the pirate becomes the captain, and the captain tells stories to the kid. And somewhere in that telling, another adventure begins. That's what I think Jimmy Buffett understood about life. We don't spend our entire lives sailing away from home. We sail away so that eventually we can understand what home means. We leave so that we can return. We collect stories so that we can share them. And we live adventures so that someday someone younger can hear about them and think, I want to see what's out there. And maybe that's the real meaning of the captain and the kid. The captain isn't just the end of the journey, he's the keeper of the beginning. And the kid isn't just the beginning. He's the reason the journey continues. Because every captain was once a kid, every pirate was once a sailor, and every sailor once looked toward a horizon, and every generation eventually gets the chance to become the captain telling the kid, go see what's out there, and then, when you're ready, come home and tell us about it.